The sun dipped low over the mountains of Colorado Territory, casting long shadows across the weathered porch where Lillian Morgan stood frozen in place, a small carved wooden horse clutched in her trembling hand. The toy had been a gift for her son's 5th birthday, a birthday he would never see. 3 weeks had passed since they'd lowered James Jr.'s small coffin into the unforgiving earth, victim to the scarlet fever that had swept through Timber Creek like wildfire in the summer of 1873. Lillian ran her thumb over the smooth wooden surface of the toy, her wedding band catching the fading light. At 26, she had already lived several lifetimes of joy and sorrow. The mountain air, once a comfort, now seemed to mock her with its crisp vitality when her own child lay cold beneath the soil. "Lily," her sister Martha called from inside the cabin. "You ought to come in. Night's falling and it's getting cold." Lillian didn't move. The cold hardly registered anymore. Nothing did. Her husband James had been gone 2 years now, thrown from his horse while working cattle up in the high pastures. She'd managed to hold together the pieces of her life for their son's sake, but now, with little James gone too, what was left? "I'll be in shortly," she answered, the words mechanical, devoid of feeling. Behind her, the empty cradle sat in the corner of the porch where she'd dragged it the day after the funeral. She couldn't bear to see it inside the cabin anymore, couldn't stand the sight of the hand-stitched quilt and the small pillow that still held the faint scent of her child. Yet she couldn't bring herself to dismantle it either. So there it remained, gathering dust and morning dew, a silent testament to what she had lost. Martha appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've made stew. You need to eat something, Lily. You can't go on like this." Lillian nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the last light of day was fading. "I'll come in. I just needed some air." Martha's eyes fell to the toy in Lillian's hand, then to the abandoned cradle, her expression softened with compassion. "Maybe it's time we put that away," she suggested gently. "It might help to know." Lillian's voice was sharp, final. "I'll decide when it's time." Martha sighed but didn't press further. She'd come to stay with Lillian after James Jr.'s passing, worried about her sister's deepening melancholy. 3 weeks, and Lillian still moved through the days like a ghost, tending to chores with mechanical precision but never truly present. "Very well," Martha conceded, "but the stew's getting cold." That night, as on every night since the funeral, Lillian lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small cabin. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by dreams where she heard her son's laughter only to wake reaching for a child who wasn't there. The ranch around her 40 acres of decent grazing land with a small stream running through it had once been her and James's pride and joy. Now it felt like an anchor, tethering her to memories too painful to bear but too precious to abandon. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Lillian had made a decision. She couldn't stay in this hollow shell of a life, but she couldn't leave either. If she was to remain, she would need help with the ranch hired hands to tend the small herd of cattle and fix the sagging fence lines that James had always maintained. After breakfast, which she barely touched despite Martha's concerned glances, Lillian announced, "I'm riding into town today. We need supplies and I need to see about hiring someone for the ranch work." Martha looked up from her mending, surprise evident in her features. It was the first initiative Lillian had shown in weeks. "That's a good idea. Would you like me to come with you?" Lillian shook her head. "No. I need to do this myself." The ride into Timber Creek took nearly an hour, the trail winding through stands of aspen and pine. Autumn was settling in early this year, with patches of gold already appearing among the green. Lillian remembered how James Jr. had loved to collect the colorful leaves, pressing them between the pages of her Bible. Timber Creek was a modest settlement, a single street lined with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of other establishments catering to the needs of the surrounding ranches and the occasional prospector still hoping to strike it rich in the played-out mines. As Lillian tethered her horse outside Hargrove's general store, she was painfully aware of the sympathetic glances cast her way by townspeople going about their business. Mrs. Hargrove, a plump woman with kind eyes, greeted her warmly as she entered the store. "Lillian, dear, it's good to see you in town. How are you faring?" "I'm managing, thank you," Lillian replied, the practiced response coming easily to her lips. "I need some flour, coffee, and sugar, please, and I was wondering if you knew of anyone looking for ranch work. I need help with the cattle and repairs before winter sets in." Mrs. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully as she measured out the requested items. "As a matter of fact, there's a fellow just arrived in town last week, been doing odd jobs for folks, seems handy and honest. Jace Dawson's his name. I believe he's helping Mr. Peterson repair his wagon today. You might catch him there if you're of a mind to." Lillian hesitated. Bringing a stranger onto her land felt invasive yet necessary. "Thank you, I'll inquire." After paying for her supplies and arranging to have them loaded onto her horse, Lillian made her way to the blacksmith's shop, where Peterson kept his wagon repair business. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal guided her to the open-fronted workshop. Two men were working on a damaged wagon wheel. Old Peterson with his white beard and leather apron, and beside him, a tall, broad-shouldered man Lillian didn't recognize. He was stripped down to his shirt sleeves in the heat of the forge, his forearms sinewy and tanned from outdoor work. A battered cowboy hat hung on a post nearby. Peterson noticed her first, setting down his hammer. "Mrs. Morgan, good day to you. What brings you by?" At the mention of her name, the other man straightened and turned. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with sun-weathered features and clear blue eyes that assessed her with quiet interest. There was a scar along his jawline, partially hidden by several days' worth of stubble. "Mrs. Hargrove mentioned you might have someone helping you who's looking for steady work," Lillian said, addressing Peterson but aware of the stranger's gaze. "That'd be Jace here," Peterson confirmed with a nod toward his companion. "Jace Dawson, this is Mrs. Lillian Morgan. She has a spread about an hour west of town." The man wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, offering a respectful nod. "Madam." His voice was deeper than she expected, with a slight drawl that suggested he'd come from somewhere farther south. There was something in the way he stood, alert yet easy, like a man accustomed to being ready for anything that spoke of a complicated past. "Mr. Dawson," Lillian acknowledged, "I'm in need of help with my ranch. Cattle to be moved to the lower pasture before winter, fences to be mended, a barn roof that needs patching. It would be temporary work through the winter with room and board provided." Jace Dawson studied her for a moment before responding. "I'm finishing up here with Mr. Peterson today. I'd be available starting tomorrow if that suits." There was something reassuring about his directness, the lack of pity in his gaze that Lillian had grown so weary of seeing in others. "That would be acceptable," she replied. "Can you ride out tomorrow morning?" "The ranch is along Cedar Creek, past the old Miller property." "I know it," he said with a nod. "I'll be there by mid-morning." As Lillian rode home with her supplies, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Having help with the ranch was necessary, but bringing a stranger into her life, even in such a limited capacity, felt like an enormous step. What kind of man was Jace Dawson? Peterson seemed to trust him, and Mrs. Hargrove had vouched for his character, but Lillian had learned the hard way that life offered no guarantees. Martha was surprised when Lillian told her about hiring Jace. "A complete stranger. Are you certain that's wise, Lily?" "We need the help," Lillian said simply. "And he comes recommended." That evening, as dusk settled over the ranch, Lillian found herself once more on the porch, her gaze drawn to the abandoned cradle. On impulse, she covered it with an old blanket, as if hiding it from view could somehow make the pain it represented more bearable. Morning brought a crisp clarity to the air, the kind of day James had always loved for working cattle. Lillian was up before dawn, determined to present a composed front to her new hired hand. She dressed in her practical work clothes, a sturdy skirt, blouse, and boots, and tied her chestnut hair back with a ribbon. Martha had prepared a hearty breakfast, commenting that the mysterious Mr. Dawson would likely be hungry after his ride. "Men always are," she said with a knowing smile. "James could eat half a deer after a morning's work, as I recall." The mention of her late husband brought the familiar pang, but Lillian found it slightly less sharp than usual. Perhaps it was the prospect of forward motion, of taking some action rather than merely enduring, that blunted the edge. Jace Dawson arrived precisely when he said he would, riding up to the house on a well-muscled bay gelding. He'd cleaned up since their meeting at the blacksmith's, his face freshly shaved save for a neat mustache, his dark hair trimmed. He wore a faded blue shirt under a worn leather vest, practical work clothes that had seen better days but were well maintained. Lillian met him in the yard, noting that his saddle bags and bedrolls suggested he traveled light. "Mr. Dawson, you found us without trouble." He swung down from his horse with easy grace. "Mrs. Morgan, yes, madam, it's a straightforward trail." His eyes took in the ranch with a quick, assessing glance, the small but sturdy cabin, the barn and corral, the pastures beyond, and the distant glint of Cedar Creek. "I'll show you to the bunkhouse," Lillian said, indicating a small structure near the barn. "It's basic but sound. You'll take your meals with us in the main house. My sister Martha is staying with me for a time." Jace nodded, leading his horse as he followed her. "You mentioned cattle needing moving and repairs. I'd like to ride the property today if that's agreeable, get a sense of what needs doing first." The bunkhouse was simple 4 walls, a stove for heat, a narrow bed, a table, and a chair. It had stood empty since James died. Before that, they'd occasionally hired seasonal help when the work demanded it. "This will do fine," Jace said, setting his saddle bags on the bed. "Thank you." There was an awkward moment of silence. Lillian realized she'd gotten used to being alone with her grief, with only Martha's gentle presence for company. Having this stranger here, this man with his direct gaze and quiet confidence, felt like an intrusion, yet also oddly like a breath of fresh air. "There's a map of the property in the barn," she said finally. "I'll show you after you've settled in." As she walked back to the main house, Lillian caught sight of the covered cradle still sitting on the porch. Something made her pause, then detour to move it inside, tucking it into the storage room off the kitchen. Out of sight, if not out of mind, over the next several days, a rhythm began to establish itself. Jace would rise before dawn, tend to his horse and the few cattle in the near pasture, then join Lillian and Martha for breakfast. He worked steadily through the day, taking only brief breaks for the midday meal. By evening, when he came in for supper, the evidence of his labor was clear: fence lines straightened, barn roof partially reshingled, firewood chopped and stacked for the coming winter. He spoke little, answering questions directly but rarely initiating conversation. Yet Lillian found his presence oddly comforting. There was something solid about him, reliable in a way that required no words. On the 4th day, as he was preparing to ride out to check the north pasture fences, Lillian surprised herself by saying, "I'll ride with you." "I should see the condition of things myself." If Jace was surprised by her offer, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and said, "I'll saddle your horse." The ride to the north pasture took them along Cedar Creek, where aspen leaves shimmered gold against the blue autumn sky. For the first time in months, Lillian found herself noticing the beauty around her rather than moving through it in a haze of grief. "Your land has good water," Jace commented as they rode. "That's valuable out here." "My husband chose it for that reason," Lillian replied. "He said a ranch is only as good as its water source." She hesitated, then added, "He died 2 years ago, an accident." Jace nodded, his expression somber. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Morgan." "Lillian," she corrected, surprising herself again. "If you're to work here, you might as well use my name." "Lillian," he acknowledged with a slight incline of his head, "and I'm Jace." When they reached the north pasture, it was clear the fence line had suffered from neglect. Several posts were leaning, and in one section, the wire had been trampled by what looked like elk. "This will need a full day's work," Jace assessed. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds." Lillian dismounted, walking along the damaged section. "I used to help James with the fencing. I haven't been out here since." She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought aloud. Jace seemed to understand. He dismounted as well, examining the nearest post. "Your husband built solid fences. The foundation is good. It's just maintenance that's needed." Something in the way he said it made Lillian look at him more closely. There was no judgment in his tone, just simple observation, yet she felt he was speaking of more than just the fence. "Yes," she agreed quietly. The foundation is good. On the ride back to the ranch, Jace asked about the cattle, how many head, their condition, where they wintered best. The practical questions anchored Lillian, giving her something concrete to focus on. We've never had more than 30 head, she explained. James always said it was better to manage a small herd well than a large one poorly. We lost some after he died. I couldn't manage them all myself. 30 is a good number for this land, Jace agreed. Enough to be worthwhile, not so many they damage the grazing. As they approached the ranch, Lillian noticed Martha hanging laundry in the yard. Her sister looked up, a knowing smile crossing her face at the sight of Lillian returning with Jace. That evening, as they sat around the supper table, Martha drew Jace into conversation, asking where he'd come from and what had brought him to Timber Creek. Texas originally, he answered, his usual economy with words evident. Been moving north for a few years. Worked ranches in Kansas, then Nebraska. Colorado seemed like a good place to winter. And before Texas, Martha pressed, earning a warning glance from Lillian. Jace took a drink of water before answering. Army, Confederate, but that was a lifetime ago. The war had been over for 8 years, but Lillian knew its shadows lingered for many. She studied Jace's face, wondering what he had seen, what experiences had shaped the quiet, capable man who sat at her table. And family, Martha continued, ignoring Lillian's increasingly pointed looks. None living, Jace replied simply, effectively closing that line of inquiry. Later, after Jace had returned to the bunkhouse and Martha was preparing for bed, Lillian found herself in the small room where she'd stored the covered cradle. She stood looking at it for a long moment, then slowly pulled back the blanket. The empty cradle, lovingly crafted by James during her pregnancy, seemed smaller than she remembered. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood, remembering the nights she'd sat beside it, rocking her feverish child, praying for the fever to break. The prayers had gone unanswered. "You shouldn't torture yourself, Lily," Martha said softly from the doorway. Lillian quickly covered the cradle again. "I'm not, I needed to see it." Martha crossed the room to stand beside her. "It's good that you hired help. The ranch needs it, and frankly, so do you. You need life around you again." "It's just temporary," Lillian reminded her, "just until the worst of the work is done." Martha's expression was knowing. Of course, just temporary. The following weeks brought a steady transformation to the Morgan ranch. Under Jace's diligent care, the fences were mended, the barn roof completely reshingled, and the cattle gathered from the far pastures and moved closer to the ranch buildings for the coming winter. He even repaired the windmill that pumped water to the house, which had been working only intermittently for months. Lillian found herself increasingly drawn into the work, first riding out with Jace to direct him, then gradually taking on tasks herself. There was healing in the physical labor, in reconnecting with the land she and James had loved. One evening in late October, as the first real chill of autumn settled over the land, Lillian sat on the porch after supper, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, brilliant points of light in the vast blackness. She heard the creak of a floorboard and turned to see Jace approaching, a mug of coffee in his hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Lillian gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Please." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as more stars appeared. Finally, Jace spoke. "Your sister mentioned she'll be leaving soon." Martha had indeed announced at supper that she needed to return to her own home in Denver, where her husband was expecting her. The revelation had filled Lillian with a mixture of anxiety and determination. She'd grown accustomed to her sister's presence, yet she knew she couldn't rely on Martha indefinitely. "Yes," Lillian confirmed. "Her husband has been patient, but she has her own life to return to." Jace nodded, sipping his coffee. "Will you be all right here alone?" The question hung in the air between them. Lillian considered it carefully. Would she be all right? 2 months ago, the answer would have been a clear no, but now, "I believe I will," she said slowly. "The ranch is in better shape thanks to your work, and I'm stronger than I was." Jace turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful in the dim light from the window. "You were never weak, Lillian. Grieving isn't weakness." The simple statement, delivered in his straightforward manner, pierced through her defenses. For months, She'd interpreted her inability to move forward as a failure of strength. To hear him frame it differently loosened something tight within her chest. "I lost a child," she said, the words escaping before she could contain them. "My son, James, 3 months ago, scarlet fever." Jace was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "I know, Mrs. Hargrove told me when I inquired about work here. I'm sorry for your loss." "You knew?" Lillian was surprised, though upon reflection she shouldn't have been. In a small community like Timber Creek, everyone knew everyone else's business. "Yes, I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to." He paused, then added, "I lost someone too, long time ago now, my wife, Sarah." Childbirth. The revelation stunned Lillian. In all their conversations, Jace had never mentioned a wife. "The baby," she asked softly. "Didn't make it either," he replied, his gaze returning to the stars. "Would have been a little girl." Lillian's heart ached at the quiet pain in his voice. "I'm sorry, Jace," he nodded his acknowledgement. "It was during the war. I was away fighting when it happened. By the time I got the letter, they'd been in the ground for 2 months. The stark brutality of it not even being present for their deaths, learning of it weeks later by letter made Lillian's own grief seem differently shaped, though no less profound. "How did you?" She couldn't finish the question. "How did I go on?" Jace supplied. He considered the question for a long moment. One day at a time, poorly at first, then just living, working, moving. Eventually the pain changes. It doesn't go away, but it changes. They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own memories. Finally, Lillian spoke again. "There's a cradle. I had it on the porch for weeks after James died. I couldn't bear to see it, but I couldn't put it away either. It felt like closing a door I wasn't ready to close." Jace nodded his understanding. "And now I've covered it, put it in the storage room." Lillian sighed. "But I still can't quite let it go." "Maybe you don't have to," Jace suggested. "Not yet, maybe never. Some things we carry with us." The conversation shifted to other topics after that: the weather, the likelihood of early snow, the plans for wintering the cattle. But something had changed between them, a deepening of understanding that went beyond employer and employee. Martha departed 3 days later, extracting a promise from Lillian to write regularly and from Jace to keep an eye on my stubborn sister. There were tears at the farewell, but Lillian found she faced her sister's departure with more resolve than fear. That evening, for the first time, Lillian and Jace ate supper alone together at the kitchen table. The absence of Martha's cheerful chatter made the meal quieter, but not uncomfortably so. "I've been thinking," Lillian said as they finished eating. "With Martha gone, it seems silly for you to eat out here and then return to the bunkhouse each night. The spare room is available if you'd prefer to move into the house." Jace looked surprised at the offer. "That's generous, but are you sure it's proper? People in town might talk." Lillian hadn't considered that aspect. In her grief, she'd grown somewhat indifferent to town opinions, but she recognized the truth in his concern. Her reputation was one of the few things she had left. "Perhaps you're right," she conceded, "though it seems a shame to heat 2 buildings through the winter." "I'll be fine in the bunkhouse," Jace assured her. "It's a good deal warmer than some places I've slept." As November progressed, the days grew shorter and colder. The first snow fell, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning of the deeper winter to come. Jace continued his work around the ranch, while Lillian found herself increasingly occupied with preparations for winter, preserving the last of the garden's produce, mending blankets, ensuring the woodpile was ample. One evening, as a more substantial snowfall blanketed the land, Lillian sat by the fire mending one of Jace's shirts. He'd torn it while repairing the chicken coop, and though he'd insisted he could fix it himself, Lillian had taken it from him with a firmness that brooked no argument. A knock at the door startled her. It was later than Jace usually came to the house. "Come in," she called, setting aside her mending. Jace entered, stomping snow from his boots. His cheeks were reddened from the cold, his breath visible in the chilly air that followed him through the door. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, "but I noticed the light was still on. Wanted to let you know one of the cows is looking close to calving. Might need attention during the night." "Calving now?" Lillian frowned. "It's not the season for it." "No, but sometimes nature has its own schedule." "She must have been bred later than the others. I've moved her into the barn where it's warmer." Lillian rose, already reaching for her shawl. I should check on her. I was hoping you'd say that, Jace admitted. I've delivered my share of calves, but an extra pair of hands never hurts. They made their way to the barn through the falling snow, Jace carrying a lantern that cast a warm glow around them. The barn was significantly warmer than the outside air, filled with the scent of hay and animals. In one of the stalls, a brown and white cow lay on her side, sides heaving with labored breaths. Poor thing, Lillian murmured, kneeling beside the animal. She's young for her first calf. Jace hung the lantern on a hook and joined her. Yes, but she seems strong. I think she'll manage. Together, they prepared for the birth, gathering clean cloths, warm water, and the few veterinary supplies James had always kept on hand. As they worked, Lillian found herself telling Jace about the first time she and James had delivered a calf together, shortly after they were married. I was terrified, she recalled with a small smile. I'd grown up in town, you see. I knew nothing about ranching until I married James. He was so patient, explaining everything, never making me feel foolish for not knowing. He sounds like a good man, Jace observed, checking the cow's progress. He was, Lillian agreed, the best I've known. She paused, then added, until recently at least. Their eyes met over the laboring cow, and something unspoken passed between them. Lillian looked away first, flustered by her own admission. The birth proceeded slowly but without complications. Near midnight, the cow delivered a healthy heifer calf, wet and wobbly but determined to stand. Lillian and Jace worked seamlessly together, cleaning the calf, ensuring it found its mother's milk, and making both animals comfortable with fresh hay. As they watched the new mother nuzzling her calf, Lillian felt a complex mixture of emotions: joy at the new life, a pang of remembered grief, and something else. Something warm and hopeful that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Life goes on, Jace said quietly beside her, as if reading her thoughts. Sometimes right in the middle of our sorrow, it just goes on. Lillian nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in her throat. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and they stood that way for several minutes, watching the mother and calf in comfortable silence. The snow continued through the night and into the next day. By morning, the ranch was transformed into a winter wonderland, with drifts piled against the buildings and trees laden with white. Lillian awoke to find Jace had already broken trails to the barn and chicken coop and had a fire crackling in the kitchen stove. You should have woken me, she chided, coming into the kitchen in her robe and shawl. Jace, pouring himself coffee, shrugged. You needed the rest after last night. There was a new ease between them now, born of their shared vigil and the moment of connection in the barn. As Lillian prepared breakfast, they discussed the day's necessary tasks, modified for the heavy snow. If this keeps up, we might be snowed in for a few days, Jace observed, glancing out the window at the still falling flakes. The prospect didn't alarm Lillian as it might have a few months earlier. We have plenty of supplies. And good company, she added, the words slipping out before she could consider them. Jace looked at her with a slight smile. Yes, we do. The snowstorm lasted 3 days, effectively cutting off the ranch from town. Lillian and Jace settled into a comfortable routine, sharing meals, tending to the animals, and spending evenings by the fire. Jace revealed an unexpected talent for whittling, his capable hands transforming scraps of wood into small, detailed figures of animals. My father taught me, he explained when Lillian admired a particularly lifelike deer he'd created. Said a man should always have something to do with his hands during the quiet hours. On the third evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Jace handed Lillian a small wooden figure. It was a horse, delicately carved with flowing mane and tail, reminiscent of her own mare. It's beautiful, she said, turning it in her hands to admire the workmanship. Thank you. It's nothing, he demurred. Just a way to pass the time. Lillian placed the carving on the mantel, next to the small wooden horse that had been her son's. The two figures, one old, one new, stood together, a bridge between past and present. Tell me about your son, Jace said softly, watching her. The request surprised her. Few people had been willing to broach the subject directly, tiptoeing around her grief rather than acknowledging it. James Jr., she said, her voice steady despite the familiar ache in her chest. We called him Jamie. He was 4 when he died, so full of life, always running, exploring. He loved horses, would have been a fine horseman someday. He had his father's eyes and my stubbornness, or so James always said. Jace listened intently as she spoke, his expression compassionate but not pitying. When she fell silent, he asked, "And what did he love besides horses?" The question opened a floodgate. Lillian found herself sharing memories she had kept locked away. Jamie's delight in thunderstorms, his habit of collecting interesting rocks, the way he would sing to himself when he thought no one was listening. To her surprise, speaking of him brought as much joy as pain. "He sounds like he was a remarkable boy," Jace said when she finally ran out of words. "You gave him a good life, Lillian. However short, it was filled with love." Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to. These felt different, cleansing somehow. "Thank you," she whispered, "for asking about him, for listening." Jace reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "Thank you for trusting me with his memory." The storm cleared the following day, leaving the world outside sparkling and pristine under a brilliant blue sky. Jace spent the morning clearing more paths around the ranch buildings and checking on the livestock, while Lillian baked bread and made a stew from the last of the summer's preserved vegetables and some of the salted beef in the cellar. By mid-afternoon, they had established enough order to take a break. On impulse, Lillian suggested a walk down to Cedar Creek, where the snow-laden trees and frozen water would make for a beautiful sight. They bundled up against the cold and set out, following the path Jace had cleared to the barn and then breaking their own trail through the knee-deep snow beyond. The effort of walking warmed them despite the frigid air. The creek was indeed a spectacular sight, its surface frozen in ripples and swirls. The surrounding trees bowed under their burden of white. They stood on the bank, taking in the winter tableau. "I used to bring Jamie here in summer," Lillian said, remembering. "He loved to wade in the shallows, looking for minnows." Jace smiled at the image. "Sarah and I used to talk about what we'd do with our child, all the places we'd go, the things we'd teach her. Sometimes I still catch myself planning, even though." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Even though it can never be," Lillian finished for him. "I understand. I do the same." A companionable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional soft plop of snow falling from an overburdened branch. In the distance, a crow called, its harsh cry echoing across the white landscape. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Jace asked suddenly. "Starting fresh somewhere else?" Lillian considered the question. "I did after Jamie died. I thought perhaps somewhere new without the memories might be easier. But this land was James's dream, and then it became mine too. And the memories, they're painful, yes, but they're all I have left of them. I'm not ready to leave them behind." Jace nodded his understanding. "Some ghosts are worth living with." As they turned to head back to the ranch, Lillian slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. Jace caught her before she could fall, his strong hands steadying her by the waist. The sudden proximity sent a jolt through her, an awareness she hadn't felt in years. "Careful," he murmured, his breath forming a cloud between them. Lillian looked up into his face, so close to hers, and saw something in his eyes that mirrored her own sudden confusion of feelings. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and even more surprisingly, she realized she wanted him to. Instead, he carefully set her on her feet and stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should get back. It'll be dark soon." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them again, a recognition of possibilities neither had been ready to acknowledge until now. That night, Lillian lay awake long after she should have been asleep, her thoughts circling around Jace Dawson and the feelings he was awakening in her. Was it disloyal to James and Jamie to feel this stirring of life within her? Or was it, as Jace had said, simply life going on in the midst of sorrow? The days following the snowstorm settled into a new pattern. Jace continued his work around the ranch, but now there were lingering glances, conversations that stretched longer than necessary, hands that occasionally brushed against each other in passing. Neither spoke directly of the changing nature of their relationship, yet both were acutely aware of it. A week after the storm, Jace announced he needed to ride into town for supplies and to check the mail. The main trail had been traveled enough by others to make the journey feasible, though not easy. "I'll come with you," Lillian decided. "It's been too long since I've been to town." The ride was challenging but invigorating. By the time they reached Timber Creek, Lillian's cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, her spirits higher than they had been in months. Their arrival in town caused something of a stir. Lillian was conscious of curious glances as she and Jace made their way to the general store. Mrs. Hargrove greeted them with barely concealed interest. "Lillian Morgan, as I live and breathe. And Mr. Dawson, too. We were starting to wonder if you'd both been buried in that snowstorm." "It takes more than a little snow to keep us down," Lillian replied with a smile. "But we are running low on some essentials." As they shopped, Lillian was aware of Mrs. Hargrove's speculative gaze following them. When Jace stepped outside to check on the horses, the older woman leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "He's a good man, that one," she said in a low voice. "Quiet but decent. Been asking around town about him. Fought in the war, worked honest jobs since. No drinking problems, no gambling that anyone's seen." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "He's been a tremendous help with the ranch." Mrs. Hargrove's knowing smile suggested she suspected there was more to it than that, but she simply patted Lillian's hand. "It does my heart good to see some color in your cheeks again, dear. Grief has its time, but life must go on." After collecting their supplies and the mail a letter from Martha and a catalog Lillian had requested months ago, they stopped at the small cafe for a hot meal before the ride home. Sitting across from Jace at the table, Lillian was struck by how natural it felt to be with him, how easily they had fallen into a rhythm together. "People are talking," she observed quietly, stirring her coffee. Jace glanced around the cafe where several patrons were casting curious looks their way. "Does that bother you?" Lillian considered the question. "It should, I suppose. A widow living alone with a male employee. It's not exactly conventional." "No," Jace agreed. "It's not." He hesitated, then added, "I could move on after winter if that would be easier for you. There's always work to be found." The suggestion sent a cold spike through Lillian's heart. "Is that what you want?" Jace's blue eyes met her steadily. "No, it's not what I want at all." The ride home was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon was waning, the winter sun already low on the horizon as they approached the ranch. The house looked welcoming with smoke rising from the chimney. Jace had banked the fire before they left to ensure they'd return to warmth. As they stabled and fed the horses, a companionable silence settled between them. Finally, as they were walking toward the house with their supplies, Jace spoke. "Lillian, I need to say something." She stopped, turning to face him in the fading light. "Yes." Jace set down the bags he was carrying and took a deep breath. "I came here looking for temporary work, a place to spend the winter before moving on, as I've been doing for years now. I didn't expect." He paused, searching for words. "I didn't expect you." Lillian's heart quickened. "Jace, please let me finish," he interrupted gently. "Since Sarah died, I've been rootless, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to form attachments. It was easier that way, safer, but these past weeks with you, I've started to feel something I thought was gone forever." He took a step closer to her, his expression earnest in the gathering dusk. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving, and maybe you always will be in some ways. I understand that. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just wanted you to know that if you wanted me to stay not just through winter, but longer, I would." Lillian stood very still, overwhelmed by his words and the emotions they stirred in her. Part of her wanted to retreat, to protect the fragile healing that had begun. Another part, a stronger part, wanted to move forward, to embrace the unexpected gift that had appeared in her life. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. Jace nodded, his expression understanding. "You don't have to say anything now, just think about it." He picked up the bags again. "We should get inside before we freeze." That night, Lillian found herself once more in the storage room, standing before the covered cradle. With trembling hands, she pulled back the blanket, revealing the empty bed that had once held her son. For so long, this cradle had represented only loss and grief to her. But now, looking at it in the soft glow of the lamp, she saw something else as well: the love that had created it, the joy it had once contained, the possibility that it might someday serve its purpose again. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. To open herself to such vulnerability again, to risk such devastating loss. And yet, to close herself off from the possibility of love and joy seemed suddenly like the greater tragedy. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood, remembering James's face as he'd presented it to her, his pride in his craftsmanship and his excitement about the child that was to come. Would he want her to keep it empty forever, to close her heart to the possibility of new love, new life? In her heart, she knew the answer. James had been many things, but never selfish. He would want her to be happy, to live fully again, not just exist in the shadow of loss. Decisively, Lillian lifted the cradle. It was lighter than she remembered, or perhaps she was stronger now. She carried it out of the storage room, through the kitchen, and to the front door. Opening it, she stepped onto the porch where Jace stood looking out at the starlit snow. He turned at the sound of the door, his expression changing to surprise as he saw what she carried. Lillian. "What are you doing?" She set the cradle down carefully on the porch. "I've kept this closed up for too long, hidden away like my heart." Her voice was steady despite the emotion behind her words. I think it's time to open both again." Jace looked from the cradle to her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Are you sure?" Lillian nodded, taking a step toward him. "I'll always love James, I'll always grieve for Jamie, but I don't think that means there isn't room for new love too, different but no less real." Jace closed the distance between them, his hands coming to rest gently on her waist. "I would never ask you to forget them." "I know," she whispered. "That's one of the reasons I'm falling in love with you." The admission hung in the cold night air between them for a heartbeat before Jace lowered his head and kissed her. His lips were warm against hers, gentle at first, then more insistent as she responded. Lillian felt something break free within her, a dam holding back emotions she'd forbidden herself to feel. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jace rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Lillian Morgan. I didn't come here looking for love, but I found it anyway." Lillian smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "And I wasn't looking either. Sometimes life has other plans for us than the ones we make." They stood together on the porch for a long time, holding each other under the vast canopy of stars, the empty cradle beside them no longer a symbol of what was lost, but of what might yet be. The winter deepened, but within the Morgan ranch, warmth and life flourished. Jace moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse to the main house, to Lillian's bedroom, a development that caused some raised eyebrows in town but no real scandal. In the close-knit community of Timber Creek, where life was hard and good help scarce, pragmatism often outweighed strict propriety. They were married on a clear, cold day in January 1874, in the small church in Timber Creek. Martha returned for the occasion, her genuine happiness for her sister evident in her tearful smile as Lillian and Jace exchanged their vows. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the handful of neighbors and townspeople who had become Lillian's friends during her years in Colorado. "You look beautiful," Martha whispered as she helped Lillian dress in a new blue gown, not white, which didn't seem appropriate for a widow, but a deep, rich color that brought out the warmth in her complexion and the light in her eyes. "I feel beautiful," Lillian admitted, "and happy." "I didn't think I would ever feel this way again." Martha squeezed her hand. "James would be pleased. He always said he just wanted your happiness." "I know," Lillian said softly, "and I'll always love him. But Jace..." She paused, searching for words to express the complex emotion. "Jace makes me feel whole again, like I'm living, not just surviving." The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Reverend Thomas spoke of new beginnings, of God's grace in bringing healing and joy after sorrow. As Lillian looked into Jace's eyes while promising to love and honor him, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home after a long and difficult journey. That evening, as they lay together in what was now their shared bed, Jace traced the line of Lillian's cheek with gentle fingers. "Happy?" he asked. "Very," she assured him, nestling closer to his warmth. "Are you?" Jace's smile was tender in the soft lamplight, "more than I ever thought possible again." They talked long into the night, sharing hopes and plans for their future together. The ranch would need expansion if they were to make it truly profitable, more cattle, perhaps some horses for breeding. Jace spoke of improvements to the house, a larger kitchen, maybe a proper parlor for entertaining. And then, hesitantly at first but with growing certainty, they spoke of children. "I would like to try again," Lillian said, her head resting on Jace's chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "For a family, if you want that too." Jace's arms tightened around her. "I do, very much. It frightens me," she admitted. "The thought of loving that deeply again, knowing what can be lost." "Me too," Jace confessed. "But I think that's part of living, fully accepting the risk along with the joy." Lillian raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "The cradle," she said. "James made it. Would it bother you if we used it, for our child, if we are blessed?" Jace considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "It was made with love. That seems like a good beginning for any child." Spring came early to Colorado that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots beneath. The ranch seemed to come alive with the season, calves frolicking in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the hills, the creek running full and clear with snowmelt. Lillian and Jace worked side by side, expanding the garden, repairing winter damage, preparing for the busy seasons ahead. They rode into town together every few weeks, gradually becoming accepted as a couple rather than a widow and her hired hand. In late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Lillian turned to Jace with a smile that contained both nervousness and joy. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "I believe we're going to have a child." Jace's expression transformed surprise giving way to wonder, then to a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. "Lillian," he breathed, pulling her into his arms. "Are you certain?" She nodded against his shoulder. "As certain as one can be this early." Martha suspected when she was here for the wedding, said I had the same glow she remembered from before. "I've missed my monthly courses twice now and I feel different, the same way I felt with Jamie." Jace held her as if she were made of the most precious glass, his cheek resting against her hair. "A baby," he said, the words filled with awe. "Our baby." That night, by the light of a single lamp, they brought the cradle out from the corner of the bedroom where it had stood since their wedding. Together, they cleaned it thoroughly, oiling the wood until it gleamed. Jace repaired a loose joint in one of the rockers, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy over the fine woodwork. "James was skilled," he commented, admiring the joinery. "This is craftsman's work." "He was," Lillian agreed, running her fingers along the smooth rail. "He would have taught Jamie, I think, when he was old enough." There was no pain in speaking of them now, or rather, the pain was there but tempered by the joy of good memories, the appreciation of what had been rather than only grief for what was lost. "Perhaps I can teach our child," Jace suggested. "Boy or girl, it's a useful skill." The idea of Jace passing on knowledge to their child, James's craftsmanship living on through a new generation, filled Lillian with a deep contentment. "I'd like that." As the months passed, and summer turned the land lush and green, Lillian's body changed with the growing life within her. Jace was endearingly attentive, insisting she rest during the heat of the day, taking on more of the household chores even as he managed the increasing demands of the ranch. They had hired a young man from town to help with the cattle, allowing Jace to spend more time close to home as Lillian's pregnancy progressed. Martha wrote regularly, promising to return when the baby was due in late autumn. One warm evening in August, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cooler air, Lillian felt the baby move, not the flutter she had been experiencing for weeks, but a definite kick, strong enough that she gasped in surprise. "What is it?" Jace asked, immediately concerned. Lillian laughed, taking his hand and placing it on the swell of her belly. "Wait, there, did you feel that?" Jace's expression of wonder as he felt their child move beneath his palm was something Lillian knew she would remember all her days. That's our baby," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "Yes," she agreed, covering his hand with her own. "Strong, just like its father." They sat that way for a long time, hands joined over the new life they had created together, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The cradle stood ready in their bedroom, a symbol of both past and future, of grief transformed into hope. "What shall we name it?" Jace asked, his thumb making gentle circles on Lillian's rounded belly. She had been considering this question for weeks. "If it's a boy, I thought perhaps Jace Dawson, to honor both the men who have given me such happiness." She paused, suddenly uncertain. "Unless that would be strange for you." Jace's eyes met hers, full of understanding. "Not strange, an honor, and if it's a girl." "Sarah," Lillian said without hesitation. "Sarah Lillian." Jace's grip on her hand tightened, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "You would do that. Name our daughter after my first wife, of course," Lillian said softly. "She was part of what made you the man you are, the man I love." "She deserves to be remembered." Jace drew her into his arms as best he could given her condition, his face buried in her hair. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. Lillian smiled, feeling the baby shift within her. "We deserve each other, and this second chance at happiness." The baby arrived on a crisp October day, as the aspen trees were turning gold and the first hints of winter could be felt in the early morning air. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Martha arriving just in time to assist alongside the midwife from town. Jace paced the porch, banished from the bedroom during the birth, but refusing to go any farther from Lillian's side. Each cry from within the house seemed to physically pain him, his fists clenching helplessly at his sides. Finally, as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, a new cry pierced the air, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Jace froze, his heart seemingly suspended between beats as he waited. The door opened, and Martha appeared, her face tired but radiant. "Jace," she said simply. "Come meet your daughter." On trembling legs, Jace entered the bedroom. Lillian lay propped against pillows, her face flushed and damp with perspiration but alight with a joy that took his breath away. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Jace," Lillian whispered, her voice hoarse from exertion, "come see her. She's perfect." He approached the bed as if in a dream, lowering himself carefully beside his wife. Lillian turned back a fold of the blanket to reveal their daughter's face, tiny, red, with a dusting of dark hair across her crown. "Sarah Lillian Dawson," Lillian said softly. "Would you like to hold her?" With infinite care, Jace took the small bundle into his arms. The baby's eyes were closed, her tiny fists clenched against her chest. She weighed almost nothing, this miraculous new life that had brought such light into their world. "Hello, Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father." As if in response to his voice, the baby's eyes fluttered open dark blue, as all newborns' eyes are, but already with a hint of Lillian's warm brown. She regarded him solemnly for a moment, before her face crumpled into a yawn. Jace laughed softly, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "She's beautiful," he said, looking up at Lillian. "Just like her mother." Martha discreetly left the room, closing the door behind her to give the new family their privacy. Jace carefully returned the baby to Lillian's arms, then stretched out beside them on the bed, his arm around his wife's shoulders, his other hand gently stroking his daughter's cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked Lillian, studying her pale face with concern. She nodded, her eyes never leaving their child. "Tired, but happier than I can say." She looked up at him then, her expression turning serious. "I was afraid, Jace, so afraid something would go wrong." "I know," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was too." "But she's here," Lillian continued, her voice gaining strength. "Healthy and strong, and I realized something while I was laboring to bring her into the world." "What's that?" Lillian's eyes were luminous with tears and joy. "That love is worth any risk. That closing ourselves off from it is the real tragedy." Jace gathered his family closer, overwhelmed by the depth of his feelings for this woman who had given him back a life he thought forever lost, and for the tiny miracle they had created together. "I love you, Lillian Dawson," he whispered. "You and Sarah are my whole world." "And you are ours," she replied, leaning into his embrace. Later that evening, after Lillian had been helped to bathe and change into a fresh nightgown, after Martha had brought them a simple supper which they ate by the fire, Jace carefully placed their sleeping daughter into the cradle beside their bed. The wooden horse that had been Jamie's stood watch from the nearby shelf, a silent guardian from the past. As the cradle rocked gently, Sarah slept peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought her parents to this moment, of the grief they had endured and the love that had healed them both. Lillian watched from the bed, her heart so full it felt it might burst. This was not the life she had planned, not the family she had first dreamed of. James and Jamie would always be part of her, their absence a space she carried within her soul. But here now was a new dream, a new family, a love born from the ashes of loss but no less precious for its unexpected nature. "The cradle is filled again," Jace said softly, coming to sit beside her. Lillian took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Yes," she agreed. "Just as you promised." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white, not an ending, but a new beginning, full of promise and hope for the future they would build together.